Welcome to Infinite Models. If you like building aircraft, any type of armor, how about prehistoric or current wildlife? Autos of all shapes and sizes and genres, seafaring subjects of all types, and figures, vignettes, and dioramas, then this group was made for you.
Last week, I kicked off and I told you about Pearl Harbor and the devastation that took place there, and the 24 Catalinas lost, right off the bat. There was only 5 flyable by the 4 by the end of the day. One of them was badly shot up in the air. And then we had, dang, it looks like I'm going to have to watch this later. Oh, all right, Christopher, it'll be posted, my friend. I wish we could interact some more, but you do what you need to do. This will be on the site. And then they were dispersed around the Philippine Islands to try to prevent them from all getting destroyed in one fell swoop like what happened at Pearl. Nonetheless, they eventually got run out of the Philippines and they had to go south down to the Dutch East Indies. And I talked about the Japanese advance all the way down through the Southwest Pacific and how they just were taking over everything. And this is last week's map. I need it just for a minute to open up tonight. But April 1942. And I talked about in the early April, but the one big long distance flight to replenish some of the last struggling holdouts at Guadalcanal, fighting the Japanese, and the incredible mission flown by 2 Catalinas, one of them that ran aground and ripped his hull open, but they got out of the 55 people that were put on the planes, they wound up getting 35 of them out of there. They had to leave like 20 of them behind because they were taking on so much water on that bird they couldn't get back up in the air. But the mission was in the end a success, while the people that they had to leave behind with the other Philippine defenders all went and became Japanese prisoners of war. But one heck of a mission that could only be done by the Catalina. So here we are in April 1942, and America and its allies are just getting mauled in the Southwest Pacific. Video in UK's rubbish. Oh, sorry, man. See you, Steve. And Glenn is having a trouble spelling corregidor, but I know what you meant. Yeah, oops, misspelled. So anywho, the Americans and the Allies, we are just getting mauled in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese, they had plans, and so what they wanted to do was shore up their southern and their northern boundaries. And so down in the south, what they wanted to do was they wanted to come in and land at Port Moresby, which was down here in the southeast New Guinea. And from Port Moresby, they wanted to spread further south down to New Caledonia and Fiji, and eventually all the way down to Samoa. And by doing that, with the continent of Africa here, I did it again, Australia here, they could put down the eastern side a complete ring of defense that would cut off Australia from America and all the resupplies. So Rabaul, Port Moresby, and then down south, New Caledonia, Fiji, all the way down to Samoa. They saw this as a way to cut off Australia from America. And in the north, what they wanted to do was to go from Japan. They wanted to, and the Kuril Islands up north, they wanted to extend all the way up to the Aleutians off of Alaska, and actually go from Japan to the Aleutians. And then from the Aleutians, they wanted a line down through all the islands to Midway, and if they could, eventually all the way down to Hawaii. And by having, by carving that, the Japanese would have been untouchable in the Pacific. And there's no way that the U.S. could have gotten anything back or done in the entire theater if they had secured the New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, and then from Kuril to the Aleutians to Midway, and eventually maybe even Hawaii. Those were the grand designs, the grand plans of the Japanese. And so in the South, their plans to land at Port Moresby were kind of thwarted. They were frustrated by the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the Coral Sea's out here. The Battle of the Coral Sea was the Japanese, while it was technically a loss, maybe closer to a draw because of the size of the forces that they had in the South and the Southwest Pacific. But the Battle of Coral Sea was technically a loss. But the Japanese only saw it as a setback, right? And the reason they saw it as a setback was that they sunk the Lexington, they sank an oiler, they sank a destroyer, and they badly damaged the Yorktown. And so with knocking out 2 carriers, right, one permanently, the destroyer, the oiler, they went on ahead and they landed. Now I'm going to take, this was last week's, I just needed it as an example. So what they did was on the 4th of May, as they planned, they landed way down here at the southern end of the Solomon Island chain, and they took Tulagi. And this was right on their plan. From Tulagi, they also already owned Guadalcanal. They started building an airfield here. And between Tulagi and Guadalcanal, they could then start, this was their stepping off point, and they had a seaplane base down in Gavutu. And so between Gavutu, Tulagi, Guadalcanal, they could now start that big march south to Caledonia, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. And this was what the Japanese were looking to do. So back up north, they had decided they were going to assemble the 200 ships they put together. Out of those 200 ships, 8 of them were carriers. They had 11 battleships, all kinds of other combatants, transport, support ships. Admiral Nobutake Kondo, he came with what they called the Second Fleet, and he joined up with other units out of Guam and Saipan, and they all came together, and they were going to approach Midway from the southwest. And then Admiral Nagumo, who was the commander of the Hawaiian attack, he was coming with another very large force from the northwest. And even Admiral Yamamoto, who was on the super battleship the Yamato, was coming behind that with the main body of the landing forces and what would hold Midway Island after they had taken it. And so to counter this massive bit up north, the United States we were able to put together about 50 ships facing 200. So out of our 50 ships, however, we had no battleships. We only had a few cruisers. The rest were destroyers and transports and support ships, but not a lot of combatants. We had 3 carriers. That was the good news. However, one of those carriers was ironically the USS Yorktown, that after the battle for the Coral Sea, where it was badly damaged, it made its way back to Hawaii, and it spent 3 days in dry dock getting emergency repairs. I mean, literally, bubble gum and Mach 1 tape and duct tape holding the ship back together. They repaired it as hastily as they could to push her back into the fight, go. And so we had, the Yorktown was part of the 3 carriers. And at Midway Island, the U.S. put all of our ships and forces to the northeast of Midway Island because we assumed that the Japanese were going to come from the northwest towards Midway Island. And we were trying to set a trap that we could spring on them. So the bad news was 50 ships, 3 carriers. The good news, the plus side, was that we had a lot of land-based aircraft, including a number of PBYs. And land-based aircraft have basically twice the range that carrier-based aircraft did, at least in those days. And the PBYs have like 4 times the range, right? I see, Andrew. Hi, John. Glad you made it, buddy. And so the other thing we had was the program called Magic. We had broken the Imperial Japanese code in their communications. And so we put out a message basically in the clear that said Midway Islands water vaporizers or water boilers were down and they could not make fresh water. And Glenn keeps trying to get me to use MI. I'm talking about, I can't remember the Japanese code for Midway Island. The Japanese had a name for it, and so and I just can't remember what that is. And so we put out, Midway Island couldn't make fresh water, and the Japanese coded that Midway Island, but whatever their code name was for it, they put out Midway Island can't make fresh water. Now is the time for the attack. And so we knew that they were going to attack Midway Island, and which was the good news. It's not great news because even though we had broken their code and we could read their communications, we didn't know, from what direction they were coming. We didn't know how big the task force was. We didn't know what the date of the attack was. We just knew that Midway was the next target. And so that came through that broken communication, the code breaking. So that was very cool. Well, we set up, we're setting this trap, we're ready to go. And so here we go. Remember all the lessons I talked about last week, the issues of using the PBYs. The good lesson, the lesson learned was out of Hawaii, the commander there wanted to do 700-mile searches because he figured the Japanese would have to get within 250, 300 miles to be able to make an assault on the Hawaiian Islands. As it turns out, they launched from 325, wave number 1. He was absolutely correct. So the first lesson was you need patrols out to 700 miles to detect the enemy and to give yourselves time to, focus yourself for the defense. So that was lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 was not to use the PBYs during daylight hours or where they might come in contact with enemy fighters because the enemy fighters were just chewing them up. And so at Midway Island, what they did was they had 24 PBYs that they put into 8 degree. If you look around like a face of a clock, every 8 degrees was a search sector. And each 8 degree sector was 700 miles long. So 24 airplanes, 8 degrees gave them 192 degrees from the south up to the north, just over 180 degrees of search sectors 700 miles long. And they started sending the PBYs out, searching for the Japanese fleet 700 miles distance. So on the morning of June 3rd, early in the morning, Ensign Jack Reed is flying his sector, and he got to the 700-mile limit, and instead of turning, he decided to actually fly a little further. And it's one of those moments in history where why did he make that decision? Nobody knows, but guess what? It turned out to be advantageous because as Jack Reed continued out, he came across the 10 ships that were under the command of Admiral Kondo coming up from the southwest. And he radioed back to base and he said he found the main body. Well, what he found was actually the occupation force, not the main body, but that's okay. And so with that radio message back at Midway, they immediately launched 9 B-17 bombers to fly south and attack this column of 10 ships. There's 2 columns, 10 ships. They sent the B-17s out, and just like I talked about last week, high altitude aerial bombing of ships underway in the ocean is just stupid and very ineffective. And so these B-17s dropped all their bombs, nothing happened, not a single hit. Well, while those B-17s were out, 4 more PBY-5s happened to arrive from Pearl Harbor. And so they landed and they taxi up. Now these are PBY 5s, not the 5As, so they're not amphibians. And they go out and they put the beaching gear on them and tow them up out of the water. And the crew is gathering their gear. They're still on airplanes. They haven't even gotten off them yet. And the ground crew that was at Midway just descend on these 4 planes like flies, and they start doing turnaround on the engines and checking all the fluid levels and turning around the aircraft. And the ordnancemen are out there, and they're slinging 2,200-pound Mark 13 torpedoes under the wings. The pilots are like, what the heck is going on here? Well, they go into a briefing tent, and there's a general up front. I almost said admiral, but a general up front. He's giving the briefing, and he says, we've got 4 volunteers who are going to be taking off in those PBYs and going out and striking the Japanese fleet attacking from the southwest. And the 4 volunteers happen to be Lieutenant Red Richards right here, and Charlie Hibbard was a Lieutenant JG, flew in one of those 4 birds from Pearl. He said, Lieutenant Richards, you'll be flying his bird. And Lieutenant JG Doug Davis was volunteer number 2. Ensign Dagwood Probst was one. And the general says, and that young man way back there in the back ended up being Ensign Al Rothenberg. He's volunteer number 4. And so these guys learned that they were getting ready to take off with their torpedoes and to go after the Japanese flotilla that's coming up from the southwest. 9:15 that night, VP-24 airplanes were coded 24P for patrol and then their serial number. VP-11 aircraft were 11P and so on. And so VP 51 was coded 51P serial number. And the 4 airplanes get out there 9:15 at night, and Lieutenant Red Richards takes off with Charlie Hibbard joined him, flew the plane up from Pearl. So they're flying 24P12. They're the lead. Dash 2 is 24P7 flown by Lieutenant J.G. Doug Davis. Dash 3 is 24P11. That one's flown by Ensign Dagwood Probst. And Dash 4 is Ensign Al Rothenberg, and he's in 51P5. Well, as they start to taxi out, Ensign Rothenberg has some engine trouble. His plane kind of remains behind for a bit. Crews go out and they start working on it. He doesn't take off for like 25-30 minutes after the other 3. Well, the other 3 taxi out. The planes get up on the step. Boom, break the ground. They're airborne. And Lieutenant Richards, he had tail lights on in the PBY to get takeoff up to altitude, heading south, and then they shut all the lights off, no radios, and they're headed south looking for the Japanese ships. And they were told that you can figure about, it's going to be several hours, and about 550 miles south of here, you should come in contact with the enemy. So they start flying south. Ensign Rothenberg finally gets off about 30 minutes later, and he goes solo, just flying, trying to catch up with the rest of the group. Well, it is an absolutely gorgeous moonlit night over the South Pacific, and they're flying, and there's billowy light clouds with a floor of about 1,000 feet, and they went up to about 3,000 feet, maybe a little higher in places. And the PBYs were flying on top of that, and every now and then they'd kind of punch through some clouds. And they're flying south, and unbeknownst to Lieutenant Richards is, with the 3 aircraft that are with him, Probst got lost and disappeared from the flight. So it's only Richards and Davis, 2 airplanes. The third and fourth he doesn't know are not back there. Well, Dash 3 is trailing and Dash 4 is really trailing, but they're all going in the same general direction. Beautiful night for flying. About midnight, Dash 1, the radar operator, he comes up and says, target 12 miles, 10 to 12 miles off the port beam. How many ships? Just 1. So like, well, okay, is that a picket ship for the enemy? Maybe a lone trawler, transport ship? They're looking for a column of 10. So Richards opts to just options to keep on going, find the column of 10 ships. So they keep flying south, and about 1:15 in the morning, radar calls back, the navigator calls up, and he says, target 10 ships off the port beam. Now he knows that they've got their targets. And so Richards he takes the controls back from Hibbard, and he turns the aircraft down moon, and he heads down. They're looking at the ships kind of passing off in the distance, and when he heads down moon, he's putting the Catalinas in such a way that the ships, it's really hard for them to see them. And so he heads out down moon, and he maneuvers around, and they start dropping down, but there's only the two cats. He doesn't know that. They're dropping down, getting ready to make their runs, and so Richards and Hibbard, they start their run together, and Richards passed control of the torpedo to Hibbard, and Hibbard's also doing the throttle. Richards is flying the airplane. And so Richards gets it down to where about 100 feet off the water, and he lined up on what was the biggest silhouette. He was kind of hoping it was a carrier. As it turned out, it just turned out to be a big transport ship. But he's lining up on the biggest silhouette, and he's coming in from a beam port on this ship. And as they're flying, they're waiting for the fire to start. They're waiting for, just came back to me, Emma, no, Glenn, don't say, I can't remember the Japanese name for Midway. They had a special name for it, that's all. I'm not looking for the U.S. code, but I know what you're saying, and thank you, but it's the Japanese name I was looking for. I can't remember what they called Midway. Anyway, he's coming from the port side after this ship, and the torpedo launcher sight system was mounted above the dash and on the front windscreen, and it had two sight reticles and a centerpiece, and depending on which seat you were in, right, pilot, co-pilot, depended on which of the sight reticles you used to line up for a torpedo launch. And it took a lot of practice. These guys knew the finicky nature of the Mark 13s. They knew, when they were in practice, they're like, when we're in practice, if you miss, you go around and you try again, right? But this was combat. This was real. This was, if you miss, Japanese ships are getting through and going fine. So they really want to make sure that they hit these things. And hi, Tim. So they're lining up, and Hibbard, he is all over that sight reticle. He must have reset that thing like 4 times as quickly as he could. And he finally just says, you know what, I've got it. And he's on the sight reticle. He's doing the throttles, getting the airplane down to about 120 knots. And Richards finally yells at him about 800 yards from the ship, and he goes, drop the damn thing. So he reaches down and boom, releases the torpedo. It lets go and hits the water, and they give it full throttle, and Richards is pulling back on the control column, and the plane comes up and goes right over the top of this great big, transport ship that they're on, and the tunnel gunner is out the back. And he's seeing that they're starting to fire back, and all of a sudden the tunnel gunner comes back. It's a hit, saw a flash. And in the truth, turns out we learned later, no, they didn't actually hit that ship. Hibbard, in his memoir, had always written that he wasn't sure if they got a hit on that or not, and he was sure that the flashes from the return fire from the Japanese could have been mistaken for the flash of a torpedo impact. But so they launched from about 800 yards out and didn't really hit the ship. Unfortunately, the Mark 13 torpedoes were very temperamental. When they first started to use them in 38, 39, they had all kinds of issues. They weren't really adequately tested by the time war broke out in 41. Even in early 42, they were continuing to test them and make refinements, but they just were not reliable. And so that was the first run. That was Richards and Hibbard. Davis, in the meantime, Doug Davis was following Richards around, and he gets down on the water, and he starts making his run, and he's selected the ship he's going to go after, and he too knows the finickiness of the Mark 13, and he really didn't like his first run setup. So he breaks off and kind of retreats up to the north, climbs back to 2,000 feet. They're resetting all their gear, and he wants to set up a better run to try to make sure they hit something. And so He comes back down and he lines up on a aft of the ship at a port quarter. He's making his approach, and the ship starts a turn to starboard. And that really threw him off because it put him almost directly abeam from the back end of the ship, which meant for a hard run. But he's pressing in, and he holds on to his torpedo until he's only 200 yards from the target, and he pumps the fish away, goes to full throttle, pulls back on the controls, and just barely misses the ship as he's pulling up. He's flying 125 miles an hour. Well, the problem was that they saw the torpedo. They know it impacted the ship. He dropped it, and he was so low, and it entered the water so smooth, and it ran so true. But he got to under 200 yards when he released it. It ran so short, it never self-armed. And his torpedo just literally bonk and off the ship. And so they're taking fire and taking fire. They fly off. The third plane, Probst, finally makes it into the area. He had kind of gotten lost on his way down. Probst comes into the area, and he turns and he starts settling down to the water to make his run. And in the distance, as it turns out, standing on the bridge wing to the Japanese tanker by the name of the Akebono Maru. So the Akebono is sailing along, and the captain is on the bridge wing, and he knows something's going on. He's trying to figure out what it is. He's looking around. It's hard for him to tell. Everything's kind of in the distance from him where he's at in his tanker. And then he starts to hear it. The sound of throttled back engines are kind of approaching, and then they're getting louder. And then when the airplane goes to full throttle, and he turns to yell some commands into the wings, and all of a sudden, kaboom! That humongous explosion, and the Akebono Maru was hit and sunk by the third airplane piloted by Dagwood Probst. He came down and he hit that thing, and as Dagwood went over the ship, he kind of feinted to the right and made a tight turn to the left, and the other ships in the area are all firing up after him, and he has to get out of the area. So thus far, 3 attacks, 1 sinking, right? 1 good hit and a sinking of a tanker. Well, the fourth plane, flown by Ensign Rothenberg, unfortunately never amounted to anything. He got down to the area where, the Japanese ship should have been, and he does a small search pattern, and then they have a certain level of fuel where they have to turn for home because they can't go into reserves, and then there are special reserves, but he has to go back. So no joy for Ensign Rothenberg, and no radio contact. So all 4 planes independently are heading back to Midway Island. And as they get back to Midway Island, it's sun's just starting to come up. They get under 100 miles to Midway, and they start hearing air raid Midway Island. Midway Island is under an air raid. Well, they can't land in that, and so their first alternative was to turn and head south to Lisiansky Island, which is about 250 miles down the Hawaiian Island chain, and that was their first alternate. So these guys turn from Midway, they start heading south, and they're trying to go Lisiansky Island. And as they get down there, Lisiansky is covered in a ugly storm front that's like 80 to 100 miles long. The whole island is obscured, and within this front they can't even see it to make a safe approach. So they have to turn and make their way to Laysan Island. Well, Probst, the choice was made for him. As he was approaching Lisiansky Island, his airplane ran out of fuel. They were already on such a long mission. As soon as they took off, they had to lean the engines way out to try to preserve as much fuel as possible. So they were running really lean. Then all the combat maneuvering and going full throttle, escaping from the ships. Matter of fact, it was Probst who hit the Akebono Maru. Well, he was chased by an A6M2N float plane, and he got into some clouds and evaded that little seaplane, but it cost him fuel to do so. So when he got down to Lisiansky, he couldn't do anything else. He had to set his plane down dead stick in a storm off Lisiansky Island, and Probst and his crew bobbed about in that airplane for 3 days until they were picked up by another Catalina from VP 51 operating out of Hawaii that saw them and stopped to pick them up. And the plane was so damaged that when they transferred over to the VP 51 plane, they just fired all along the hull of their Probst aircraft and sank it on the spot. In the meantime, Davis, he finally lands at Lyson Island, and he had about at like 10 a.m. and he only had 10 to 20 gallons of gasoline remaining in his tanks. Shortly after that, Richards and Hibbard showed up in 24P12 about 45 minutes after that. And finally, Dash 4 Rothenberg in 51P5, he shows up at about 11:05 a.m. and he too was critically low on fuel. But the point is, they lost one airplane, no crew, and they proved that was the first time in naval and naval aviation history that a nighttime torpedo attack was carried out, and they sunk a ship in the process. And it only cost them one airplane, but it cost the Japanese Navy a very large tanker and all of its precious cargo that it was carrying to supply the rest of the Japanese fleet with fuel. And so even Admiral Spruance, he wrote about that attack and said, maybe we found something, certainly more viable to do with the otherwise rather maligned PBYs. Now we can put them in an offensive capability. So behind them, as they're, trying to find a place to land, the battle for Midway Island is raging on, and it would become the turning point, what many historians have called the turning point in World War II. The Japanese lost 4 carriers. They lost like 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers and another oiler. They lost over 200 aircraft and something like 2,000 men. It was a crushing defeat. And it was all facilitated by being discovered south and north by PBY Catalinas that were in the fight running their sectors. Now I want to transition. So we have kind of the turning point there, right? They've applied the lessons learned from Pearl Harbor and from the Philippine Islands and from the fighting down south in the Dutch East Indies. I want to talk to you a little bit now about fighting at night and technology advances. So, humans have always, we typically function best in the daylight, right? When you can see, your senses are all good. The night tends to bring with it, it amplifies your fears. Sounds and everything are exaggerated, fears are amplified. And in that kind of a state, you can really turn that and use it to military advantage. Well, the Japanese, prior to World War II, the breakout of World War II, they had been practicing and training very heavily for night combat, both individually with soldiers in their army and with the ships in nighttime engagements, sailing, targeting distances, how to gauge target distance, how to, firing flares to put overhead to engage targets. And the Japanese were very well versed in night fighting. However, air attacks, right? Night attacks by aircraft, especially at sea, were virtually unheard of. So for an aircraft, especially over water, the inky blackness of the water, there's no or the horizon is obscured from the night, nothing to help you gain where you're at. The moon and the clouds and everything cast really unusual shadows and images off the water, and all that goes to give pilots vertigo. So night attacks by aircraft are virtually unheard of. In the meantime, in the United States, way back in 1922, in the Potomac River area south of DC, we had been playing with detecting reflected radio waves to detect ships, surface vessels from a land base. And it wasn't called radar at the time, but what eventually became radar, which is the radio detection and ranging. That's what radar stands for, radio detection and ranging. We had been playing with radar since 1922. By 1934, we had actually worked out where we could sweep the sky with radio waves and detect not only bearing but range, the distance to an object, even aircraft. 1939, we had exercises going on in the Caribbean, and the USS New York was outfitted with one of these full-on radar sets. I think it was just starting to get the name radar about then. Somebody had coined it. Well, in that exercise in the Caribbean, it was so effective during those exercises that the U.S. went out and ordered 20 more sets to get on other select ships that we figured might need it in the near future. Well, at the same time, the British were messing around with radio waves, reflected radio waves at the same time. And by 1940, they had actually come up with an airborne air-to-surface vessel, they called ASV, air-to-surface vessel radar, where they could detect ships from an airplane. And the British and the Americans were kind of collaborating, were sharing these ideas, now this new technology coming. And by the summer of 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had outfitted some PBM-1 Mariner aircraft with ASV, the Airborne Surface Vessel radar sets, and we put them in Iceland, and they were out hunting the North Atlantic for the wolf packs, the German submarines, to try to help the cargo ships crossing the North Atlantic to get over and supply England. So all of this work is going on, and by early 1942, we actually had miniaturized it, not the right term, but made it small enough that we were installing these radar sets on PBY Catalinas. And when we did that, what we wound up doing was giving the cats night eyes. They could see at night and through bad weather. The Japanese, on the other hand, they knew about the U.S. and the British and are delving into radar, and the Japanese kind of looked into it. Their scientists played with it for a little bit, but between all of their stunning victories that they had in Korea and China, and then the Kuril Islands, the 1922 conflict with the Russians, and then their expansion south, radar took a back seat to them. Not to mention culturally, now this is ironic, culturally to the Japanese, radar was seen as a defensive tool and not an offensive tool. And so therefore was not in the spirit of the samurai, right, or the individual soldier or the Japanese army writ large, that radar did not support them philosophically in their samurai spirit. And so they ignored radar, and it became kind of a backseat thing to them, and they would move on like that into World War II, much to their detriment that they passed on this, and they would pay dearly for that approach. So here we move. This tonight is what I want to talk to you about, where we really get into the seesaw and the back and forth, and how the Catalinas and the radar helped really set us up for a big turn in the tide in the war. The Japanese came down and they landed on Tulagi. This is the Solomon Island chain, and down here San Cristobal is the southernmost of the Solomons, but it's not germane to this part of the story, so I drew this large enough. I'm hoping you can read this. It's easier to see than some of the previous maps. But from Bougainville in the north down to Madawaske and Melita, Guadalcanal in the south, the Japanese on May 4th, they landed at Tulagi, and they took that over right on schedule, right? So they held Tulagi in the Solomons. They had a seaplane base further down here at Gavutu. They owned Guadalcanal, and they were now prepping to start their push, I'd mentioned earlier, further south to New Caledonia, Fiji, and eventually to Samoa, to border off the eastern side of Australia, block it from the United States. So they've got all that going on, right? But the defeat at Midway and losing 4 carriers and the cruiser, 2 destroyers, and the transports, that changed all that. And so what the Japanese decided to do was, the northern end of the Solomons was Bougainville, and just up from there was Rabaul, and Rabaul was on the southern end of a New Britain island which was off the end of New Guinea, right? And so at the southeastern end of New Guinea was Port Moresby. And the Japanese focused their attack on Port Moresby, southeast corner of New Guinea, and they were going to march their forces up to the northeast, and over the Stanley Owen Mountains and take objectives in the southwest and take over New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. That was kind of their plans. And so while they're rethinking their moves to the south and they're getting ready to hit Port Moresby, and the Americans, however, we started thinking more offensively. And General MacArthur, first thought that rolls off his mouth is he wants to go hit the Japanese at Rabaul. That is their stronghold. They got all their land-based aircraft there, all their command and control elements there, all their logistical distribution. Everything happens at Rabaul. He wants to hit the Japanese right in the mouth at Rabaul. Well, the Navy planners are kind of thinking that, we got to get there from here. We're not just going to. And so the Navy planners say, what we think we should do is we should hit Tulagi, and we'll set up kind of a three-pronged approach. We'll take Santa Cruz, which is down here kind of off the map, and we'll get Santa Cruz, we'll hit Tulagi, we'll grab some of the adjacent islands, including Guadalcanal, and the Japanese had started an air base that we took over, and when we finished it, we called it, Henderson Field, and Melita and Maramaski Island. So they want to get these adjacents and then start working our way up the Solomon Island chain till we get to Bougainville. And once we own this, then we'll hit Rabaul. And that's kind of where the Navy planners were at. And so on 2 July, they started this whole thing. And for those of you that are familiar, this area in here is technically called the New Georgia Sound. It's named after the island here, New Georgia. So this is the New Georgia Sound, but a lot of people just called it the Slot. And so we begin our assault. We take from Santa Cruz, and we had 5 PBYs from VP 11 and VP 14 were operating at Ndeni Island down near Santa Cruz. And we had the Mackinac, which was a seaplane tender, with 9 PBYs of VP 23. I drew a PBY here because it was anchored right between Maramiske and Melita Island. And so we had 9 PBYs operating out of here. And that's about 75 miles east of Tulagi. And we are getting ready to start all of this forward movement, right? And so we took the Japanese seaplane base at Gavutu, and Alexander Archer Vandergrift, the very famous Marine Corps general, he starts with a landing 7 August. They land on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Within 1 day of those landings, they had achieved all objectives, which was almost unheard of. But the Marines advanced, and they put Marine engineers quickly on the ground, and they go in and they start facilitating and building up what the Japanese had started. And that was 7 August, and by 12 August, a PBY Catalina lands at Henderson Field on its 2,600, at that time, 2,600-foot runway. And by the 20th of August, they've already got Marine F4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntlesses, and there was a place for PBYs and other aircraft to land. They're flying in things with supplies and command and control, and just incredible quick expansion into Guadalcanal. Well, the Japanese, this really puts a damper on their plans to grab New Caledonia and Fiji and Samoa, with the U.S. owning the airfield and the southernmost islands in the Solomon Island chain. So the Japanese have got to let us know that just cannot go unchallenged. And so what the Japanese start doing, remember I told you, they practiced and practiced. They owned the night. And so every night they would send ships down the slot, and it became the U.S., just the soldiers and Marines just started calling it the Tokyo Express. Every night ships would come down the slot, and three things would happen. Number one is cruisers and destroyers and sometimes battleships would engage U.S. ships, and at night they were sinking more American and Australian destroyers and cruisers and oilers and other ships. Just they were building artificial reefs out of U.S. shipping at night. That was the first thing. The second thing that was happening, they would pull up on the north end of Guadalcanal and start shelling Henderson Airfield. They wanted to knock that out. They wanted to keep the Americans from having the air base and having land-based fighter power available to us to defend and expand. And that was exactly what the Japanese, remember I told you last week, every time they took over an island, they'd put up an airfield and they'd bring land-based aircraft in. And they used the land-based aircraft with their longer legs and more ordnance and firepower to cover their further seaborne assaults going south. Having land-based air power just literally doubles and triples the air power capability from your aircraft carriers. And so they knew the advantage to having the base. They sent ships down. Their second first task was to sink the U.S. Navy. They wanted to deal us that blow. The second task was to put out Henderson Airfield so that they could keep land-based fighters from landing there. And the third purpose was that they had troop ships that kept coming down, and on the northern tip over to Tulagi and at Guadalcanal, they kept reinforcing the Japanese garrison and soldiers there by dropping off more soldiers. And so the Japanese did that every single night. And during those times, especially at Henderson Field, after the naval bombardment would stop, they would send, single engine fighters down who would strafe and drop grenades and small bombs on Henderson Field and fly away. And with kind of the tongue-in-cheek humor that goes with some of the U.S. servicemen of the day, they took to calling those flights Washing Machine Charlie, because he'd come down throwing stuff out, ancient airplanes. They were just disruptive, but it was to cause lack of sleep and stress on the soldiers. And so that stuff happened all the time. Now the irony is, all of September and October 1942, this routine settled in, where the Japanese came down the slot by night, engaged American ships, shelled Guadalcanal, and dropped off troops. By day, we would repair Henderson Field, fly in more airplanes, running missions up and down the slot and the other islands, reinforcing the Marines with more troops. And so the Japanese owned the night and the Americans owned the day. And during this period, the PBYs got deeply involved out of Endeni Island and from the Mackinac that was, here off between Melita and Marasique Island. And so the Catalinas start flying just night missions over and over and over again. And they were flying bombs, sometimes up to 4 250-pound bombs, 200 each wing, sometimes lighter bombs, but general purpose and high explosive fragmentation. They're dropping these things on the Japanese troops. They're dropping them on the ships. They're trying to torpedo the transport ships, because if you just get one a night, right? Because they're only bringing a couple down to reinforce. If you can get one or two a night, we can stop them from reinforcing their garrisons. And so the PBYs are going every night, and they're going after this Japanese shipping. They're always doing it by night. And the fighting at that point got so bad, and actually flying became so dangerous. And it wasn't the flying, it was actually the landing and the taking off. By this point, we got hit in the face December 7th. The Philippine Islands were taken over in February. The U.S. is purely on the defensive. By, I think, March, I think, was the Doolittle raid. And we had, by April, we've been pushed all the way out of the Pacific. May, we've turned things around. This is into September and October. We are now almost 1 year into this war, and our machine, our industrial capacity, has just ramped up like it's nobody's business. And we are sending stuff down to the Southwest Pacific like it is cool. Coming in through Australia, Darwin, getting, sent around through New Hebrides and all these islands. And so the Catalinas, to try to take off, these airplanes are pulling out of ports with ships and whaling boats and transport vessels, and it's like driving in and out of the Los Angeles in a car by day. Just vehicles, ships are everywhere. There was a story I read of a Catalina was trying to take off, and the pilot is between rows of military transport ships, and he's getting on the throttle, and the plane gets up on the step, and out from behind a set of ships comes this little whaler boat, and the Catalina on its present course, and if the boat didn't change course, surely the guy saw the Catalina speeding at it, right? Nope, never saw it coming. Kept going, and at the last second, the people on the whaling boat see the Catalina, and they cut the wheel, and everybody jumps off the whaling boat. They're all jumping into the water to get the heck out of the way. Well, the Catalina, the pilot, cuts the port side engine, kicks hard left rudder, and the plane starts whipping around, and as it does, the whaler goes between the outrigger and the now turned off engine, and he skids around, runs the engine back up, restarts it. That bird never lost its step. It's still up on the step. He continued pulling out of the harbor until he takes off and breaks ground, but he skidded around a whaler and took it between the pontoon and the engine, for crying out loud. As it turns out, that whaling boat, everybody got off of it safe enough, and the boat kept going until it bounced off a couple of the other military transport boats, and they got somebody on it jumping off of a transport to take the wheel and stop the whaler, and they got everybody back on the boat and continued. But in and out of the harbor was just a nightmare with all the boats and planes and transport, so even taking off was a problem. Well, the Americans started doing, they called the washing machine Charlie from the Japanese. Well, we would fly up to Choiseul and Vella La Vella and Bougainville and Rabaul, and we started harassing the Japanese by night, and we called them the Louis the Louse missions. And these guys they'd go up at night, and they'd put 100-pound bombs, like 8 of them, 4 under each wing, and then they'd load up sticks of grenades and other light bombs and munitions that they'd store in areas all amidships in the PBY that could be thrown out of the blister windows. And so they'd fly up over these Japanese, and the loiter time on a PBY was forever. So they'd take off down here, the aircraft at the Mackinac, or they'd take off out of Endeni, and they'd come up to Guadalcanal, and they'd go to La Vella, Choiseul, and they'd fly over the Japanese positions and drop a bomb, and fly off. And they'd stay away long enough that the Japanese would think it's over with. They'd turn around and come back and drop a bomb, a stick of grenades, and they just harassed them all night long while they're also searching for ships and things. Well, if you think back to Rothenberg, who I told you about, missed everything at Midway, he was out one night with 2 torpedoes, 1 under each wing, searching for targets, and the Japanese are now landing ships as often as they can at the northern end of Guadalcanal, transport ships, reinforcing it. They wanted to shove the Marines off Guadalcanal into the Coral Sea and have it back once and for all to continue their plan south. Rothenberg is out flying, and he gets the call, the MO, dash, 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 radio detection and direction finding. He's getting a call that they found a target, and he turns and he starts heading in. He's so grateful. He's ready to finally kill something. He's not going to miss his chance again. And they got these transport ships are coming down, and the other pilot lets him know through flashes off the wingtips, there's Morse code, and tells him where they are. And so Rothenberg turns, and he gets down on the water, and he's approaching the Japanese ships, and he releases his torpedo, and as he does, he has to go full throttle, pulls back on the stick, up and over the ship. Well, the Japanese start from all over the place are just firing at him like gangbusters. And when he clears the ship, he just shoves the yoke forward and dips right back over, gets right back on the water. And as soon as he does, all firing stops. And it was like silence. He's trying to figure out what happened, and there's the silhouette of a Japanese ship in front of him. He was between 2 columns, and when he came over one and dropped back down, they couldn't fire at him because they'd be shooting at each other. He takes full advantage of the situation. He pickles off his second torpedo and wham! Smacks a Japanese transport before it got to shore up the Guadalcanal forces, and he sank the transport. So Rothenberg, he's a happy young man now. Al Rothenberg. He finally got his kill. He's in the war. Well, in the meantime, other Catalinas they're in this fight. They're taking this war to the Japanese. And one of the guys, the pilot, they came upon the transports. They fired. He had 4 bombs. So he tips over, and his co-pilot is holding the pickle. And as the pilot's screaming in the PBY, he starts calling off methodically, drop 1, drop 2, drop 3, drop 4. This guy's pickling off the bombs. He pulls up, and they just came under intense fire. And he calls back to the radio man, and he says, "Tell base radio, we just attacked a cruiser, and the whole Japanese Navy is shooting at us." And then a second later, kind of tongue-in-cheek, he goes, "We are returning to base, scared stiff." The radio man in the Catalina sent that message back, word for stinking word. And when they landed back to the base and taxied up, a radioman from the base comes out, and they had actually printed out that message and gave it to him. And the pilot of that airplane, after the war, had that framed and up in his house. "We are returning to base, scared stiff. The whole Japanese Navy is firing at us." So those are the kind of things taking place. Well, 2 other particular missions I will tell you about real quick before I wrap up. Major Jack Cram, he was the personal pilot to Marine General Roy Geiger, who was the air commander for the Marines down in the Solomon Islands. And Major Cram, he flew, the personal bird was called the Blue Goose that was flown for General Geiger. Well, they're landing those troops, and Major Cram wants to help put an end to that, so that he has torpedoes loaded up on the Blue Goose. He takes off one night, heads up to the northern end of Guadalcanal, and he makes his assaults on the Japanese troop transport ships. He dropped on the first one, all to no avail. He drops on the second one, wham, he takes out a transport ship, but as soon as he hit it, it was like kicking a hornet's nest. 4 Japanese fighters, 2 roofs and 2 zeros. They jump him, and they ride him all the way back to Endeni Island. And he learned that night what so many Catalina pilots had learned, and that is, those cats are tough. And he is just taking a shredding. He's getting hit and bounced. He finally lost 2. They peeled off, probably running low on fuel. He gets all the way back south to his field, and he's making his final approach. And this roof is on his tail in the approach pattern, still going, mad that he sank, the transport, I guess, all over him. And it took another Marine F4F Wildcat comes in and bounces that roof and shot it down to clear Major Cram to land. And he lands and taxis back in, and they put on the beaching gear and pull him up on the beach. And Major General Geiger is standing there waiting for Major Cram to come up. And that airplane looked like Swiss cheese. It was so full of holes. Nobody on board was injured, but the aircraft was an absolute mess. Major Cram comes walking up, and Major General Roy Geiger is standing there. And as Major Cram approaches him, the general says, "I have half a mind to court-martial you for destroying my airplane." Major Cram standing there looking at him, and slowly General Geiger goes, Major realizes he was on the short end of kind of a joke there, but the general was not happy the plane was shut up, but he sank a troop transport. He actually got the Navy Cross for that mission because of all the damage he took, fighting off 4 fighters, coming back, sinking the tank, the troop transport. Amazing mission. So the last one, I will tell you that about this time, the PBYs are flying all their missions at night. The dark blue tops are good, but they're not dark enough. And so the crews start to take, what they did was they made a mixture of soap and lamp black. And the lamp black, you guys know what that is, to blacken items out. You burn off the high soot pots, like smudge pots. So that lamp black mixed with soap and now it's thinned and it's spreadable, and they're literally taking mops and brushes, soap and lamp black, and they're coating the tops of their PBYs. And where the PBY was just kind of ungainly looking before, now they almost are like sinister in the daytime. The black is blotchy in appearance, and it's kind of glossy, but they are coating them with mops and anything else, and they start flying. And I'll tell you what, when they were jumped by Japanese aircraft, they could take that airplane, because they had an altimeter and the Japanese did not, and put that PBY about 50 feet off the water, and the Japanese didn't dare follow them down. They couldn't see, no horizon, couldn't see them. The black on black, they'd virtually disappeared, and the PBYs started to operate with virtual impunity when they started applying that lamp black on the aircraft. Well, one night, flying up to Guadalcanal, the Japanese were on the north. They keep getting reinforced by night. Well, Jim Cobb was the pilot, and he's coming up from Indeni Island, and he has to overfly Henderson Field, and he's going to go run some Louis the Louse missions against the Japanese in the north. But he radios ahead to the folks at Henderson Field to let them know he's coming so they won't shoot him down. And over the radio, his brief message to let them know he's coming, he simply sent, "The Black Cat flies tonight." So Jim Cobb, in that radio message to Guadalcanal and Henderson Airfield in late October 1942, is probably the first time that they had recorded calling those black PBYs the Black Cats. And the name stuck. And so next week I will talk with you guys about the Black Cat Raiders. And all that started after October 42. So I've kind of covered from April to October of 42. I hope you have found this interesting. It's good to be here with you guys tonight. Don't forget, live from the car show tomorrow, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. In the meantime, get going. Join us in the group build, the Junkyard Dogs group build. And I look forward to seeing you guys the rest of this week. Join a room. Have a ball. It's great to see you guys. This is Vince for Infinite Models. Have a great week, and I'll see you all next Friday. Bye for now.
We hope you have enjoyed this Infinite Models presentation.